Hello, welcome to another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. My name is Jamie Johnson, and today we're going to depart a little bit from the political and go more to, I guess, the natural, and that is natural disasters. We're taping this now with Hurricane Irene scheduled to hit the East Coast this weekend, and coming up on Monday will be the 6th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. Joining me today is our guest, Tom O'Keefe. Tom, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Now, let's tell a little bit about who Tom O'Keefe is, because the O'Keefe name, there are several O'Keefe families. You're not, are you related to the O'Keefes that are here in Hudson, or?
No, I'm not. I'm originally from New York.
Okay.
I was born and raised there, originally the city, Brooklyn. And then about halfway through grade school, we moved to Long Island. And that coincided with my dad becoming a professor and teaching at a college. And graduated from high school there, and then went to college in Boston, graduated at Boston College. And then I went to Loyola University School of Law in New Orleans. And I went down there in 1982. Graduated in 1985. I'd met a local woman. We married in 1984 and stayed in the area. Had 3 children, have 3 children, raised all
What
three.
are your children's ages?
Our oldest, Danny, is 26. Shannon is 23, and Ryan's 20. He'll be 21
Okay.
coming up.
So you still got a couple in college, one in law school, I understand?
Right. We've got Danny graduated from James Madison University in Virginia. He's now a U.S. Border Patrol agent stationed in Southwest Arizona. Shannon is in her 2nd year of law school at Hofstra University in New York. And Ryan is a junior at the University of Missouri.
So kind of an East Coaster, and then you go to school down in New Orleans, meet a local girl, and then you're down there in New Orleans raising a family, and along comes one of the biggest natural disasters in the history of our country.
Correct.
And what brings you here? We'll just fast forward. You're here today. You guys now live here in Hudson? You
We
and
do.
your wife?
Yes, we do. I'm now general counsel to Anytime Fitness at their corporate office in Hastings. Came up here March of 2010. And first lived at Woodbury, and then we were, learning the area, and we very much liked Hudson. So we thought we'd come over and we'd rent in the areas and see if we like it, and then, which we do, with the idea of then buying a home.
Okay, great. So you and your wife are now Hudson residents, and let's go back to before you get here, or what maybe brought you here with Hurricane Katrina. And I thought what we do is give our viewers an opportunity to hear firsthand what it's like to go through a storm like that.
Sure.
My family and I had a chance to go down with our church on a mission group, and thousands of people have been to the New Orleans area. We particularly went to Biloxi and also did some work in eastern Louisiana.
Right.
But that we were there 3 years after the fact, and I remember doing an early morning jog through Biloxi and still seeing the seaweed and some of the remnants, a mile inland from the shore. Let's give the setting for the folks where you lived in proximity. I know landfall was in pretty much the southeast corner of Louisiana, and the eye of the storm kind of went right over Biloxi, and
Right.
And you were where in relation to that?
Our home is on the North Shore, as we call it, which means to locals that we sat north of Lake Pontchartrain. Lake Pontchartrain is about 24 miles wide, its widest point. So we're on the north side of that. The South Shore, as we would call it, which would be where New Orleans and the suburbs are located. So where we were, there were 2 significant things. One, we were located above the mandatory evacuation zone. And 2, we were spared any of the flooding, because unlike the South Shore, we don't have the bowl effect on the North Shore. So
and I'll say that again because emphasize, and this is the bowl effect you're talking about?
Right.
Okay.
Which complicated things, which I'll explain in a second. But where we were, we sustained tremendous wind and tree damage, substantial. It looked after the storm like pictures of some of the towns and cities in Europe during World War II with the bombing. It was beyond words, surreal. It's the closest I can come to begin to describe it. I remember standing in my driveway looking, thinking we would not have electricity for 6 months, maybe. The basic services were not going to happen for weeks minimally. And we had a family medical situation that prompted us to remain through the storm. That then after the storm came and went, we determined that even despite that, we needed to move on and evacuate. So we did that, and we went to Fort Myers, Florida. And a couple of interesting things about that was when we left, we were unaware that the city had flooded because, as you pointed out, the eye went over the western coast of Mississippi because the storm had kicked east at the last minute. So when you're in a hurricane, the best place to be is on the west side when it hits land because you're 180 degrees removed from the counterclockwise rotation of the storm, and as it goes over that land, it slows it down. So by all accounts, New Orleans was spared in many respects, which would be good news.
Other than the wind damage you referenced for the North Shore.
Right, you're not going to escape the wind damage. That's that is what it is. So when we left, we had basically came to determine that the scope of the storm was Baton Rouge, Louisiana, to Pensacola, Florida. That was basically the cone. So anything within that range, you had no electricity, you had limited water if you had water. Basically, everyone was gone.
Right.
And it wasn't until we got to Tallahassee that you were back to a normal environment.
Where you had even contact with media, because you wouldn't have media reports to tell you that the city had flooded.
Right. All we had was WWL Radio, which is a flagship station in New Orleans. They had set up a station, a makeshift station in a high school on the west bank of New Orleans. So even those folks were not in the know. And certainly to the point of not being able to tell anyone that there had been flooding. Also, you have to think that now all of a sudden we have no way of communicating because the cell phones don't work, house phones don't work, computers don't work. And our saying was that we went from the Jetsons to the Flintstones from a technological perspective, which is kind of frightening because all of a sudden you're incommunicado. Now also we didn't know, like I said, about the flooding, but when we were en route to Florida, when we went through just north of Biloxi actually, on Interstate 10, we hit a point where we were reduced to one lane of traffic, and it was driving like on a beach, and you just wended your way through beach debris. So that meant that the storm surge had covered the interstate, which is 4 miles inland.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, that I-10 is a good 4 miles from the beach.
So that gave us more idea about the significance of what had happened. So then when we learned that the city had flooded, I'll never forget this, we went to a Cracker Barrel off of I-10 in Tallahassee. And as we were walking in, they had one of those newspaper vending machines, and they have that day's paper displayed in the window. And it's an aerial view of the city of New Orleans underwater. And we looked at each other and we're like, that can't be. So I went inside, I said, what happened to New Orleans? And the waitress said, it flooded. And we was like, how could it flood? And they said, well, the levees broke. Now that's a misnomer to a local because the Mississippi River and Lake Pontchartrain levees, let's put it this way, if they breached, there is no city, it's completely underwater. Right. But what actually happened was the Industrial Canal levees breached. And that's what caused the flooding, which obviously we come to learn later. But the significance of the bowl effect is, unlike other areas where if water rushes in, well then with gravity and when the storm subsides, it will recede. When it flooded in New Orleans, because of the bowl, it couldn't recede.
Right.
So it sat
it's
there.
Literally built under sea level.
And many parts of it are. So when this water goes in, now there's no way to get it out unless you pump it out. So now you're going to have a situation where instead of water sitting there for, say, 12 or 15 or 24 hours, is now going to sit there for weeks until it's manually pumped.
Right.
And so that just exacerbated the scenario, and certainly would have hampered the relief effort, the rescue effort, any effort to get any resource into the zone, if you will.
Now, with this storm, which it amazes me that only 1,836 people is the statistic that they quote that were confirmed dead with the hurricane. But part of it was the much better warnings, and they say it's not nearly the most deadly, because the most deadly was I think 1900. There was one
Right.
that wiped out the city of Galveston and took many of thousands of people. But Hurricane Katrina, for those that may not remember, actually went over the southern portion of Florida and the Keys, and did destruction there as a Category 1. And then once it got over the Gulf of Mexico, that's where, going over that warm water, it got up to the Category 5.
Correct.
And so you had days for many places to prepare. But what was that like in those days before it hit? I mean, what were you preparing for? What did you know as far as the magnitude that it might be?
Well, initially, we didn't give it probably the attention that it deserved, because, as you point out, it went over Florida first. And you know, when you're in Louisiana, the first thing you worry about is a storm getting into the Gulf. So initially, this was on the ocean side, and if it was going to end up in the Gulf, it was going to have to cross Florida, and that would presumably slow it a little bit. And ironically, at that time, I was in-house counsel for Ruth's Chris Steakhouse. And I went back through my email, and there was actually an email message that went out on the prior Friday, which had been the 26th. And it was advising that our restaurants on the east coast of Florida were all closing for the weekend because of Hurricane Katrina, and to keep them in our prayers.
Okay.
So that's how sort of removed we were from thinking that storm is going to affect us, never mind to the extent that it ultimately did. We thought it was just limited to, southeast Florida.
Right.
And then, within 24, 36 hours, all of a sudden it's in the Gulf, as you mentioned, it re-energizes, and then it's a question of, okay, now how is it going to track? And then it tracked right at New Orleans. I mean, they were very accurate in predicting its path, without question. But, unfortunately, what happens prior in these kinds of situations is you get word there's a hurricane, you pack up, clothes for a couple of days, and maybe you drive, to Jackson, Mississippi, or wherever. And then the storm misses, and then, blows on by, and then you drive back home. And so the mentality was probably more of that up until that storm got, say, maybe halfway in the Gulf south of New Orleans. And then the seriousness of the chance that it was A, going to hit, and B, be the Category 5 that it ultimately was, then really set in. Now, of course, that retards the evacuation process. That then leads to congestion, panic, things like that.
Well, as you said, that it was a good 48 hours that they knew that it was coming to New Orleans.
Yes.
So at that point, are people going to the Home Depots and the Walmarts and the Targets and just buying stuff off the shelves?
Certainly.
Generators, you can't buy one, I suppose.
Right. I mean, you'd walk in and it would look like a place had been looted, because everything of any resource that you would need to survive days through canned goods, water, generators, things like that were just gone.
And that was because the mentality was, this is going to be a storm, and we just need to stock up on supplies, and we'll wait our way through it. The thought of a mass evacuation was not there then.
I think it was underestimated.
Okay.
I think that's the best way to put it.
Sure.
I mean, certainly if you judge it by the number of people that were in the mandatory evacuation area and still didn't evacuate, I think speaks to that.
Right. Well, and in that mandatory evacuation, which did go a couple miles inland, you had the rain, tremendous amounts of rain. You had the water and the wind that comes with a hurricane, but then the storm surge, and it was a huge factor, and that's what went up to 6 miles inland, I think, in parts of Mississippi.
Right, but as it relates to New Orleans, there were two other factors, if you will, that really contribute to ultimately what happens. And in each case, they are man-caused. First was what we call Mr. Go, which is the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet. And the other one was the industrial canals that I mentioned earlier. And each were designed to facilitate commerce and shipping and trade. So Mr. Go was created to make basically a channel so that commerce could flow from the Gulf to the river and vice versa, and then go through the port and do it more efficiently. But what that ultimately did was it created basically a path for the surge to then come into the Gulf, rise up, come over and then turn with the winds, and then all that water gets dumped into Lake Pontchartrain, and now it's all going to come to the south. So it has to go somewhere. So assuming that it doesn't go over the top of the levee. Well, a lot of that water would go through those industrial canals. The industrial canals were engineered so that they were supposed to have 30 feet of sheet piling support along the walls. And as it turned out, they only had 17 feet. So the water came from up underneath, and it worked its way in between the bottom of the sheet piling and the earth, and it forced its way up so that the sheet piling was bent, and then the weight of it just took it. So the Mr. Go outlet provides the avenue for the water to come in, and then what should be, sort of the neck where the water would flow through couldn't sustain it. And then that contributed and actually caused almost all the flooding.
Okay, so you were gone within 48 hours?
We left 48 hours after the storm, correct.
Okay. Once the crews came in, we were able to clear things because, there's
Actually,
trees
it
down
was
everywhere.
volunteer. There was no professional services that had reached the area yet. So it was just volunteer.
What were those 48 hours like?
Well, at first, going through the storm itself surprised me because it's not what I thought it was going to be. It's not. It didn't rain a whole lot, for one thing, and it would just be gusts.
And that would be particularly in your area. It
Correct.
didn't rain a lot. Okay.
It was, and then the wind would come in gusts, and when it came, you talk about the train effect, the whistle effect. It would sound like that, and then it would subside. But then when it started up again, you kind of braced because the severity of it was palpable. And in that area, it's the pine trees are indigenous to that 80-foot, 100-foot. I think they call them conifer pines, and they were just falling or just snapping in half, and then just torpedoing into homes, cars, whatever was in the path. So to sit there and watch that was beyond words, to be honest with you. And then when these things hit and the earth shakes, and then you're like, how long is this going to last?
Well, unlike when we have a tornado here or a tornado warning, everyone goes down in the basement.
Right.
Do you have that? Did you have that in your home?
There are no basements, so there's no shelter. So you just ride it out where you are. I wouldn't advise it. It was only, as I mentioned earlier, because of a medical situation that we had going on. But it was against probably practical advice, and I wouldn't do it again. I don't think anybody in the house would do it again.
How did your house hold up? I suppose it depends on how it's built, whether it was concrete block or wood.
Our home was fine. We had one small window that was broken, and that was it. And it was almost a tornadic effect because there are 10 homes in our subdivision, and every other home was substantially damaged. So it's just the luck of the draw, where your house was in relation to where the trees fell.
Okay.
And
so trees caused most of the damage.
Virtually all. There was wind damage. Some roof shingles may have gotten blown off, but nowhere near what the trees caused.
Okay. And they have, when you say shingles, they use asphalt shingles
Yes.
down there?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Different parts of the country have different types of, and
Right.
I know in the South a lot of it is that clay.
Yeah, that's
tile.
more in Florida.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so you're gone then, and you go to a restaurant to go in and find out that New Orleans has been flooded.
Correct.
How long were you said you went to Fort Myers?
Originally, yes.
Okay. And
I got to Fort Myers, and I was able to get on a computer, and I was able to get on my email, my work email. The company I was working for, Ruth's Chris, had just gone public, so I knew there had to be a press release. And so I located the press release, and it said that the company had been temporarily relocated to Orlando, Florida. So I just happened to be in the right state. So after situating my family, I then turned around and basically drove backwards because I had almost passed Orlando. Got to Orlando that Thursday evening, late, and when I got there, I learned that the company had been permanently relocated to Orlando, Florida.
in just that short period of time?
That period of time. So, you have, at that point, I think we had 55 employees in that building. And to the extent we could communicated with them, they were told to get to Orlando. And they came with whatever they had with them, that's what they brought. And it could be, in-laws, children, pets, some clothing, whatever they could, throw in, whatever they had taken to evacuate, with, I'm sure, no expectation that they weren't going back. So then they learned that there are now jobs in Orlando. And in many instances, they had no idea the status of their home. They didn't know whether they had their house, if their house had 10 foot of water in it, if it had 12 trees in it, it had been looted. They had no idea. They just knew that now they were going to work in Florida. Now, the company's viewpoint on that was that in a time of crisis, one thing that if you can give people some stability, let's do it. The stability here is they have a job, they have an income. It's just that now it's 650 miles away,
right.
But they have it. I get that in a lot of ways, and in other ways I don't, because I think emotionally that's an overload for people. I would have rather they temporarily relocated the company, waited till New Orleans kind of sorted itself out a little bit more, and then make a decision. For many reasons, primarily for the mental health of the people that were involved. I think from a PR perspective, from a company's viewpoint, it was a mistake because it looked like we just cut and ran and left the city behind. And that was a company that was born and raised in that city, actually had survived Hurricane Betsy, and because of the way that it acted during that event, actually launched a lot of the success of the company. And so I think strategically that was a mistake.
Well, let's talk about a little bit on your family then. Because obviously you have to be able to provide for your family, and so
Correct.
This is the status of your job, was putting the bread on the table, so to speak, for the family.
Right.
6 years, if we go back 6 years, they were teenagers then.
Yeah, at that point, one was in college, two were in high school.
Okay.
So tough ages.
Where are they going to school then? Because this happens a week before school's supposed to start.
Well, actually in New Orleans and in most parts of the South, school was already in.
Okay.
School starts early down there. So they had already done, they were in their third, that Monday would have been their third week of school. So, we're in Fort Myers. We put the two high schoolers in school down there. Our oldest was already back at college, so he was largely unaffected. And it was interesting because we put two kids, and three kids, because my niece as well, into schools in Florida. We didn't have a transcript, a social security number, an immunization record. We had nothing, and they would just come on in, and they treated us just terrifically. Can't say enough about how well that others were about our situation. But in my mind, I wanted to get my family back as quickly as I could because I wanted to restore as much normalcy to them after having gone through this.
Sure.
And I had an advantage over many people because I knew the condition of my home, and my home was livable. It was just a question of once electricity and water was going to be available, utilities were restored.
And how long did that end up taking?
Only a couple of weeks.
Okay.
It was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. The schools opened in 3 weeks.
So how long did the kids stay in school in Florida?
One stayed a month. One decided to stay the whole semester.
Okay.
I think it was sort of, they were the celebrities.
All right. And so the one that stayed this semester, I assume, was living with you since your job was in Florida.
No, because Fort Myers and Orlando are almost 3 hours apart. So other family, extended family, were in Fort Myers. That's why we went there. And so my daughter stayed with them. I went down on weekends. And then 1 weekend a month, she and I would fly to New Orleans to see my wife, our other child, and then when our one from college came back.
Okay. So you're working in Florida, but then you're going to send at least part of the family back to
Right.
New Orleans. And you get back there, what does your house look like at that point?
House is fine. Like I said, the schools, this was amazing.
What about the debris that was piled up
It was
when
there
you
for
left?
it was there for months.
Okay.
Everyone would put it out in front of their houses, and it was there forever. I mean, just forever. And on the South Shore, they literally took what they call the neutral ground. So that's the area, in between the streets, the two-way streets. A lot of them are separated, and they have what we would call, some people call it median. They call it a neutral ground, and that became the dumping areas. And it was in some cases so high that they had to build towers, so it looked like guard towers were built. And it was as long as you could see, because it was anything that was in that house: refrigerators, carpet, furniture, clothing. So everyone's everything is out of the neutral ground. And it was like that for months, literally for months.
But no looting in your neighborhood?
No, we had no looting, nothing like that. But again, you're living a very, bare existence because everything is slow to come back. And then you have this influx of people from the South Shore that had been displaced. So anyone who had a relative or a friend on the North Shore inherited people. I mean, the size of our parish, our county,
Right.
probably doubled overnight. So now, this, the services aren't there.
So just
traffic's
the
a mess.
inverse of everyone that was in the affected areas, like on the coastal parishes and so forth, they lost population.
Right.
And meanwhile, the ones that are the next further in, they gained a whole bunch.
Tremendous amounts. Yeah.
Okay.
Now, of course, a lot temporarily, but as it turned out, a lot permanently. So now all of a sudden, it was 2 hours to go anywhere.
Without getting too political, I guess, when you read Wikipedia, and of course I know that these are not very objective because different people contribute to these things and then they edit and so forth, but it's just, and I don't want to say humorous because there's nothing funny about it, but it's kind of ironic, the different finger pointing and how public officials, just out and out lied as far as what the conditions were or whether or not a certain parish was included in the disaster declaration, saying it wasn't included when they could pull out the letter and see that certain provinces like the Orleans province or parish was included. So what was that like? And you had the different levels point fingers
Right.
at each other. The feds complain about the mayor, and the mayor complain about the governor, and the
Right.
governor saying it's the other two's fault. So
I think that there was failure at every level. I think to some degree there were successes at every level, but I think the failures far outweighed the successes. I still tie back a lot of it to what happened with the engineering 30 years prior, because that was all budgetary. As I mentioned earlier, in my view, it was a man-caused disaster, and you can tie it back to government handling, if you will. I think that, in fairness, a government can only plan generally for something like this. You got a storm of biblical proportion. I don't think you can plan specifically for it.
Right.
You just can't.
well, what about these levees? Because obviously the levees were not built to the degree to sustain a Category 5.
Correct.
And,
To me, that's inexcusable. Because
are they now? When
yeah,
they were rebuilt?
They were, absolutely they were. I mean, they had to be.
Well, there was some, discussion. It wasn't exactly an
But to my knowledge,
an
they were.
obvious thing for everyone, because there was some debate going on in this parts of the country where it's hard for us to identify with folks that were in New Orleans. Why would you live there? It's underground, and this isn't going to be the last hurricane to go through New Orleans. Why would you ever go back there?
Right.
Why not just move it, and let's not spend all that federal money on those levees for something that's
I think from any unaffected person's opinion, I think that's a fair question. But if you start doing that, then what happens if, in 1989 when San Francisco has an earthquake? Do you just say, close it down? Is that the last earthquake that's going to hit San Francisco? No. In this area, you have, Fargo and Moorhead that flood. Then you get the Red River Valley. So where do you draw the line? Who gets fed? Who gets bled? So I don't look at it like that. I look at it as we're all in, and when it happens, we're going to take care of each other. That's my perspective on it. I'll tell you a really cool thing that happened in New Orleans. By Christmas, every private Catholic and Christian school in the zone was open. All done with private donation, parents, volunteer, no government. So when people rally, they'll figure it out. Sometimes the government just kind of needs to get out of their way. But the government has a role, there's no question, especially when it's something of this magnitude. New Orleans, to me, didn't stabilize until the military was brought in. And General Richard Honoré, who was just a tremendous leader at that time. I've since heard him speak. He's now does motivational speaking. He came in and he just put the flag on the ground and just said, I'm taking over. And he did. And that was refreshing to see that. And that really was the beginning of, that almost ended the event, and now we're in recovery.
So what it took was somebody saying,
I'm in charge.
we can do this, and rather than finger pointing and
I'm in
blaming
charge.
others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I like that. I respect that. And I'll always respect that guy for the way he conducted himself.
So what's it like down there now? I was there in '08 and the spring of '09. Summer of '08, it was very hot. We were in Biloxi pouring concrete for
Right.
foundations and so forth, and they were still building homes there as of last year. But what's it like now, 6 years later? You still own your home there?
I do. Get there a lot. Today, if you went there, you'd have no idea it ever happened. As I mentioned earlier, you could have gone 6 or 9 months after the event, and had you been there prior to the event as a tourist or conventioneer, you could have replicated your experience and not really known what happened. The service industry clearly was affected, but in terms of the French Quarter, the convention center, that area of the city, it had its vibrancy. It was back. It was the residential areas that just got hammered. So certainly the population shifted. I don't think it's back to pre-storm levels yet, but it's close.
Population-wise?
Population-wise. Another aspect of it I think that gets overlooked is that many parts of the city were blighted prior to the storm. So if the uninformed went down and looked, they may think that was caused by the storm, and it wasn't. So it may look a lot like it used to
Right.
look, but that may not have been that pretty. But today you could go back, you'd never know. You'd absolutely never know. And I'll tell you, that city, if nothing else, has a spirit like no other place I've ever seen, I've ever experienced. And I'll tell you another thing that I witnessed that I thought was just almost too cool for words, and that was when the New Orleans Saints won the Super Bowl.
Right. I heard that had a huge healing effect.
I've never seen a better example of a community lift a team and a team lift a community. I remember when they were getting close, to getting in the game, and of course, thanks to Brett Favre and the Vikings, they made it. And we were all determined that we were going to go to New Orleans to watch the game, not to Miami, because we wanted to be in the city if they won. And so that's exactly what we did. And the night that they won, I've never seen anything like it. There were people, I can't tell you how many people were crying. Strangers hugging strangers, cars blaring their horns. It was like a high school parking lot after a big game against the rival team. Everyone's in their Saints jerseys, like, the game wasn't there, so it wasn't like everyone was walking to the stadium, but they were just walking just to be there, like walking to a shrine. It was.
Well, we hear of different towns, and even ones that had gone through a Super Bowl drought like New Orleans had prior to last year. And when they win, there's looting, there's fires. Was there anything like that?
It was the complete opposite. It was. We went to Bourbon Street. I've been on Bourbon Street for Mardi Gras. It was more crowded than that.
Wow, that's saying a
but
lot.
But it was the safest I've ever felt in that city.
And of course, we've got coming up here on September 8th the Packers
Yes,
and
we
the
do.
Saints and the last two Super Bowl winners.
Right.
And you've got your fleur-de-lis tie on, I see.
Absolutely.
But you can certainly, even though you're a transplant to this area, you having the experience with the Saints, know what it's like when a state like Wisconsin is really behind, the Packers. We
Sure.
like to think we're pretty strong Packer fans up here.
Right.
But what do you see for this season, or particularly that game?
I think the game's going to be tremendous. And actually, I go back to last year, because when the Saints opened up, the first year after they had won, I said, whoever they're playing, I feel sorry for them, because this is the first game after the Super Bowl. They're going to put the banner up in the rafters.
Right.
And I said, the place is going to be bedlam, and it's going to be a very difficult time for the road team. I think the Saints are going to have the same experience when they go into Lambeau on the 8th. But I still suspect that they'll win.
Okay. Well, we'll see. Time will tell.
Right.
Tom, I want to thank you very much
Thanks for having
coming.
me. I really appreciate
I'd love
it.
to hear your story, and hopefully if people recognize you in the store, they can ask you their own questions. But thanks for sharing, and it's great to hear how a community and a whole area has recovered from something so devastating like that. And you know, there have been hurricanes since, but nothing, hopefully we never experience in our lifetimes anything close to that.
Right. Well, thank you again. I really appreciate the time.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you for joining us for another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal.